Good morning and welcome, everyone. We're so incredibly happy that you can join us for this August Dean's Book Review. And this is a really special event. I'm glad that we can be here. My name is Elizabeth Kronk-Warner. My pronouns are she and hers. I have the privilege of being the Dean of the S.J. Quinney College of Law. And I come to you today from the Salt Lake City Valley, and I want to acknowledge that this was traditionally indigenous land. And what's really nice about this area is this was an area where tribes would oftentimes come together in historical times to gather and to celebrate. And so it seems really appropriate that we should be gathering today to both celebrate this book and to hear and learn from survivors and to hear their stories. So I'm very glad that you can join us. I'm very privileged today to be able to include these speakers, both because we're going to hear from Professor Amos Guerra and Scott Allen, who is a third-year student at the S.J. Quinney College of Law, to talk about their book and the work that they put in their book. But also, I'm very appreciative and humbled that we have Steve Snyder-Hill and Sarah Shiley, who are also here. They are survivors and they're here to share their stories. So the format for today's presentation, I'm actually going to keep my comments relatively brief today because I think it's really important that we hear from our speakers. So after I'm done with my brief introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Guiora and Scott Allen, who's a third-year S.J. Quinney College of Law student, and then we'll hear from our survivors and hear their stories. We will leave time, at least 15 minutes, for questions and answers, and I will moderate those questions and answers. So if you do have a question, please go ahead and put it into you should have a button that says Q&A at the bottom of the screen. So please put it into the Q&A box. And I probably won't ask that question until we get to the question and answer session, but you can go ahead and put in a question into the question and answer box at any time. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Amos Guerra, who is the author of the book, The Armies of Enablers, Survivor Stories of Complicity and Betrayal and Sexual Assaults. And we're really proud of Professor Guiora and the work that he's done and the work that he continues to do. So Professor Guiora, back to you.
Thank you, Dean. I very much appreciate your willingness to enable us to have this webinar about the book, and most important of all, to give voice to the survivors. From my perspective as the one who wrote the book, who undertook the project, the most important thing for me was to give, as I say, voice to the survivors. And that is why I am beyond grateful and frankly humbled that Sarah and Steve have joined us this morning, in the same way that I have been humbled over the course of the past year and a half while working on the book, that a number of survivors from Michigan State University, Ohio State University, USA Gymnastics, and the Catholic Church agreed to interact with me on this incredibly painful question, which for me was the most important question. And that was the following: what were your expectations of the enabler? In my interactions over 15 months with the 20 to 25 survivors, we did not talk about the assaults. That was not in any way my focus, and I don't think it was their focus at all, but rather I asked them and wanted to focus only on their expectations of the enabler. And as I came to learn, without the enabler or enablers, the unimaginable assaults that these people have been subjected to, some of them over the course of years. We're talking about people who have been assaulted hundreds upon hundreds of times, would not have occurred without the enabler. I told the survivors, such as Sarah and Steve, when they interacted with me, when they agreed to talk with me, that I promised them, in return for their trusting me with their stories, I promised them two things. One, that I will make as many platforms as possible for their voices to be heard. And two, to be involved in as many ways as possible to ensure that what happened to them does not happen to others. But to understand the enabler as compared to the perpetrator, The best way that I can explain this, and I apologize for the sports analogy, but because so many of the survivors were indeed athletes, the sports analogy seems to work. The enabler in a football paradigm is akin to the offensive line, who are protecting the running back, the perpetrator, and enabling the perpetrator to go untouched to the end zone. The end zone, quote unquote, is where the survivor is there alone. The best way to describe the survivor is one word, and it didn't come from me, it came from one of the people who I interviewed. She says that the survivors were abandoned by the enabler. And the anger that many of the survivors feel today is not directed towards the perpetrator, but rather directed at the enabler and enablers. And if the book makes one important contribution, for which, from my perspective, would be beyond important, and that is that the public understand the extent to which the enablers facilitate, the enablers enable. And in many ways, it's been an undiscussed issue. And I think that we absolutely have got to come to the understanding and recognition that as bad as the perpetrators are, without the enablers, they're not going to be able to do what they have done. In addition to giving voice to the survivors, I hope that there'll be two additional consequences or impacts of the book. One is to discuss the possibility of legislating criminal code about criminalizing the enabler. I think that's essential. And two, for us as institutions to understand that we as institutions have a primary duty, one primary duty, and that is to protect the survivor and not to protect the perpetrator, because that's what enablers do. One final comment. When I undertook the book 2 years ago, I had no idea that I would be so fortunate as to be able to interact with truly extraordinary people who have greatly suffered. And I am forever grateful to them for agreeing to talk with me endlessly. I mean, this is a long, long project. And my hope is that society comes to understand the critical role of the enabler, and that we as society say enough. And the time has come to take on the enabler, because if we don't say that, what happened to, for instance, Sarah and Steve will happen tomorrow morning to someone else. And that for me is simply intolerable. I was beyond fortunate to have a team of students who worked with me on this book. This was not a one-person show whatsoever. This was hard. And I'm forever grateful to the students who worked with me, including former students who worked with me. This really was a team effort. And that's why I'm so grateful that, thank you to the Dean, that we are able to include in today's webinar, Scott Allen, who's a third-year student, who was an integral part of the team. And with that, Scott, I turn it over to you. Thank you to the Dean.
Hello, good morning. My name is Scott Allen, and like Professor Guiora said, Dean Cronk-Warner and Professor Guiora asked that I share a little bit of my experience working with Professor Guiora on the book. And again, like Professor Guiora said, I was one of several students, including undergraduate and current and former law students, who worked with Professor Guiora to research certain topics and to provide input throughout the writing of the book. And this morning, I just want to share a few of the book's main goals that I observed throughout the writing of the book. And a little bit of this might be repetitive as to what Professor Guiora just said. And I think that speaks to his ability to convey these goals, because these are the goals of the book that I took as a student working on the book. And he has already mentioned them, and they'll be mentioned again throughout this webinar event, I'm sure. The first goal, which I believe, and as Professor Guiora said, is the most important goal of the book, is to accurately reflect the survivors' voices. And their voices really are the most prominent aspect of the book, as Professor Guiora met with countless survivors over a long period of time and accumulated their stories and highlighted their voices throughout the book. And he had an undergraduate student who helped with that as well, researching and finding what are called victim impact statements, and those are also highlighted throughout the book. I also think that the format of today's meeting further brings out this goal, as we are going to be hearing from the survivors, from Steve and from Sarah later in the webinar. And the second goal that I observed working with Professor Guiora is, throughout the writing of the book, is to define and describe the enabler and to contrast the enabler with the perpetrator, to demonstrate the unique harm and trauma that is caused by the enabler compared to the perpetrator themselves. And one of the things that we found is that large institutions can act to exacerbate the enabling by trying to save face for the institution that they're working with. An example is Professor Guiora was in contact with a former employee at MSU, and this former employee described what they described as an institutional failure by the university to protect survivors of sexual assault, and over a dozen or so cases just from MSU are described thanks to this former employee who kind of gave us an inside look at what was going on there. And the third goal of the book that I observed was to analyze the law related to enabler liability. And this is where I and some of the other students performed research on specific topics of the law. For example, Brooks Lindbergh, another law student, researched and analyzed the law surrounding Title IX. And there's an entire chapter devoted to Title IX and how that is involved with sexual assault and the issues described in the book. And I personally researched enabler liability in the context of mandatory reporting laws. One of the examples in the book is a man named Cardinal Bernard Law, who was a leader in the Catholic Church who was aware of sexual assault going on by ecclesiastical leaders under his authority, and instead of reporting this and seeking liability for these individuals, he relocated these leaders to different geographical regions where they were able to continue their sexual abuse. And the Attorney General in that case cited the failure of mandatory reporting law in the state as a reason why Cardinal Law was not criminally liable for his actions. And specifically, we looked at a few of the aspects of mandatory reporting laws. We looked at who, under the law, who is liable for failing to report abuse, who is the state trying to protect, what kind of report was required by the state, who, if anyone, is exempt from liability, and what kind of criminal penalty is involved under the statute. And we, throughout the writing of the book, we looked at numerous states and compared the different state statutes and tried to make recommendations based on that analysis. So those are the three main goals that I observed working with Professor Guiora. Overall, I'm really proud to have worked with Professor Guiora on such an important topic, and I hope that the goals that I mentioned are clear to the readers. And now I would like to turn the time over to Steve Snyder-Hill.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start by saying that I've talked about what happened with me quite a bit to different people, and when Professor Guiora reached out to talk about this, something that really spoke to me about the project in the book was that I think that every time that I've ever talked about it, what I've always focused on wasn't the assault itself, but it was all the circumstances surrounding the assault. And I'll get into that. I'm going to talk about my story, and I kind of want to talk about it the same way that I lived it, so that way people can understand just how traumatic this would be to go through what I went through in my individual circumstance. So back in the 90s at The Ohio State University, I went in and was assaulted by a physician there named Richard Strauss. The day after, I went in and reported it because I just wanted to make sure that this would never happen to anybody else. It wasn't right. Anything that happened wasn't right. And I wanted to do everything that I could in my power to report it. And so I met with the student health director, which was a man by the name of Dr. Ted Grace. And I'm really big on naming these people that are the enablers because I think it's very empowering for me. So I met with this Dr. Grace and told him the story about what the physician did to me, and left a complaint, talked to him. He said that he talked to the doctor, and the doctor basically denied everything. And I said, that's unacceptable. You need to do something because you're not listening to me, what this man did to me. So he said, well, come in and we'll have you meet with him. So I did. In the 90s, I went in and they put me in front of this doctor who abused me and let him yell at me and basically let me say what I thought, the circumstances were around the incident. And then he manipulated a lot of what his responses were to me and kind of manipulated the whole situation. And it ended with him screaming and slamming his hand down on the table and screaming that I was just trying to ruin his reputation, while this Dr. Grace stood there and just looked kind of dumbfounded, like, I don't know what to do here. Now, I mean, hindsight's 20/20. We can move forward into, now and realize we should never put a person that was abused by somebody in front of their abuser and make them go through that. Psychologically, that's just not right. I'm angry about that now. Back then, I didn't know. I was a kid. These were all doctors. Dr. Grace, Dr. Strauss, and then they had a doctor that was the head of their counseling that they brought in. And so there were 3 doctors and a kid, and that was me. And then at the end of the meeting, after this guy yelled at me, their conclusion was that I was confused and mistaken about what had happened. So I left, and I wasn't happy. I wasn't satisfied. And that Dr. Grace knew that. He called me back 2 days later, and I really feel that he was trying to kind of smooth everything over and try to get me to just kind of be calm and just go away, as an enabler would do. And so I told him, I said, I'm not happy. You didn't listen to me. Nobody's done anything. I don't have any kind of recourse. I don't know what I can do. I was a kid, I didn't know what I could do as far as calling law enforcement. Nobody suggested any of that type of stuff. And so I felt like that I worked with Dr. Grace on the phone, and as an enabler, he just sat there and manipulated me. Now I know this. But I told him, I said, when we came in, we filled out these forms and it said what we were doing there. I said, if you had a section on that form that said, if you're uncomfortable with something, let us know now and we won't have the doctor examine that part. Or you can have a chaperone. Back then that wasn't the standard, and so I said that should be 100% the standard. And so I went through all this stuff with Dr. Grace, and I really felt like that he was collaborating with me. I felt like that he was working with me and that he really intently wanted to make sure that I was satisfied. And he kept just verifying that Dr. Strauss had never done this and everything else. Now, here's something that I did that probably something that isn't typical of kids my age, because I had been in the military and I'd gotten out. I was very different from the kids that were around me. I was a little bit more mature. And so I said to him, and to this day, I can't even believe that I did this because this made the biggest difference in the world. I said, I want you to promise me 3 things. I want you to promise me that this has never happened before to another person. I want you to promise me that if it ever happens again, that you're going to tell me, and then I will make sure that this never happens again. And I want you to promise me that you're going to document this in his file. And he was like, oh, yeah, it sounds great. We can do all that. And he sounded real great. And then I said, okay, then put it in a letter to me. And there was silence on the phone. I could tell, even at that moment, I didn't know that he was lying, but I could tell that I had called him on his promises and I wanted it documented. And thank God that I did that. So I got a letter from him. And, the letter, I was kind of upset because it said in there, we'll take any other complaints and will consider prior complaints, but it didn't say they would reach out to me. And I remember being upset about that. But I'm looking at the letter on my screen right now, and it says I want to assure you that we've never received a complaint about Dr. Strauss before, although we've received several positive comments. So right away discounted me and said, we never received a complaint, but we received positive stuff from him. And then it says, however, all patient complaints, both positive and negative, again, a discounting statement, are maintained in the quality assurance file that's review for healthcare organization accreditation. Any future complaints would consider prior complaints. And then your suggestions for improving the men's health clinic have been quite helpful. And again, I remember reading that and I thought, this guy assaulted me, and I'm trying to get you to put stuff in a form to stop that. It wasn't like I was suggesting changing the color of the paint in the waiting room. Your suggestions for changing the men's clinic sounded a little weird to me. Anyway, so I want to take you through this. I put that in a box in my basement, and 26 years went by in my life. And I just lived with what happened to me, and I lived with the result of what they told me, and I believed them. They told me I was confused and mistaken. And so now I know that was manipulation. So fast forward to 2018, 20 some years later, and I see Strauss's face on the TV on a newscast. And I couldn't remember his name. It was a quarter of my life ago. I couldn't remember that guy's name. I could barely remember any of the details, but man, I could remember his face. I saw that guy's face and I could smell his breath. That's how profound it was when I saw him. And so immediately I reached out and I said, I think that this might have been that doctor that, and I couldn't even remember the details of it at that point. And this is an important point to remember when you talk to survivors, because I'm going to bring this up in a little bit here. But anyway, so we come to find out a couple years later in a $6 million investigation later that OSU did, this doctor's assaulted thousands of people. And I came to find out that he had assaulted a kid 2 days before I complained. And that kid complained to Ted Grace's office 2 days prior to my complaint. He looked me in the eye and he told me, we've never received a complaint about him, only positive comments, knowing that they had a complaint 2 days before me. He told me that they would notify me if they had another complaint. A year after me, another kid complained and went berserk and tore up everything. And then they had a big hearing and then they let him retire. Just like Amos said about going through the football game, they took this guy all the way to the goal and gave him an emeritus status and let him retire. So understand that when the trauma that you have when you're sexually assaulted is profound. The trauma of finding out 24 years later how profound and protected this guy was, that they not only facilitated his abuse, but they encouraged it almost by not doing anything. And it's so infuriating, and it's at least as hard and as traumatic as the damage of the abuse itself. And that's why this book spoke to me so much, because when Dr. Guiora was saying that it's the enablers that I want to look at, I got it. That's 100%, because that's who my grievance is with, because that's who looked in my eyes and lied to me. So that made a huge change to me as far as I think that this story needs to be told. I think that the enablers need to be told. I keep saying to the Ohio State University, even the Ohio State University of today, that the only thing that's missing from today, from another Strauss happening, is a Strauss. Because institutional indifference, I get it. When you work for a big college and a big university, and you have damage control that happens and you need to protect your reputation, you sit in a board meeting in a big leather-bound chair and you don't think how this is really affecting a human being. You think this is we have to make this go away. We have to fix this. And those are the types of things. And when you're on the receiving end of that, the fix part of that, you're like, this happened to me. I'm a human being. How would you feel if this was any of your kids that were going through this? What reaction would you have to this, and how would you treat it? I suggested that if they got a second complaint from anybody, that the first person that ever complained should have a right to know that. I think that that would be one of the biggest policy changes that anybody could make that would enable any survivor to know what they need to know to be able to understand what the level of the abuse and that it's happening again. One thing that I wanted to say about memory for survivors, and I think this is profound too, is that when this happened and I found out 26 years later, I didn't remember the meeting with Strauss. I couldn't remember it. I mean, this was a quarter of my life ago. I remember a bunch of stuff happening and then found out that there was documentation that I had met with him for 2 hours. And that was traumatic because I kept going through my head and saying, I need to remember this meeting. I know that it happened. And I had people from my spouse to coworkers who were therapists who were saying, you know, don't doubt yourself. If you don't think it happened, it didn't happen. And I was like, no, there's something. I know that he yelled at me and I can't remember how I know that. And so what I did that was kind of interesting was that I needed to remember. So I needed to know who I took to that meeting with me. And I went back through and recreated my life from the day I was born to the day that I graduated high school, to the day I graduated college, what cars I drove, where I lived, who I knew, who were my friends, who I was dating. I chronologically put together my life the best that I could to be able to go back to 1995 and remember who I was dating at that time and who I would have took to that meeting. And that was huge because that enabled me to find the person that I took, reach out to them, and we talked. And by the end of that conversation, I was telling that person exactly the color of the room and the necklace that that woman wore. And when I see people testifying on TV about sexual abuse and people say, well, why now? And why couldn't you remember that? It just infuriates me because you don't understand what it's like to go through that. And I think that is such an important part to point out, is that memory and the way that it works in trauma and the way that trauma buries that memory. I mean, you know, one of the things I can say being a male is that I think that it's just as traumatic for a male or a female to go through this. You know, I'm an Army guy. Like, I'm not a not tough guy, and I've gone through this and I'm not afraid to confront anybody, but this has been traumatic. This has been something that has consumed me for years and that I just can't, it's almost like I can't get over it. And it's the abusers and the enablers that facilitated it. And what I keep saying to the current university is that if you don't understand what the actual problem is, then the problem is going to repeat itself. The problem is that everybody's acting indifferent. Nobody's treating this like that this was their child. They're all acting like that we just need to damage control. The problem is, like, the Ohio State University of today started a sexual assault task force, which was a great PR stunt. It sounded great on TV without any meaning behind it. Nobody knew what it was going to do or what it was going to be about. And they couldn't even name who was going to lead it. And then they put the head of their law school in front of it. And then the first thought for me was, does he have any sexual assault, you know, experience? So, and we asked to be on that task force and they haven't let us be on that. So I think that what they don't understand is those types of actions are what facilitates those abusers to be able to do the things that they do over and over and then be able to thrive for years and retire and let people get abused. And that's what I wanted to stop. That's what I wanted to stop in 1995. And that's what I want to stop today. And that's why I want to be part of this project with Amos and this book. I think that it's tremendously important. And I think that we keep trying to fix the problem by going after the people that are abusing, and we're not understanding that that's not going to fix the problem if you can't stop the people that are facilitating it. I'm in the Army too, and I always tell soldiers that you don't understand. If you see something that happens and you just slough it off as saying, oh, he shouldn't have done that, that's dumb, you know, he shouldn't have done that. And then all of a sudden somebody else comes and makes a similar complaint, all of a sudden you're a culprit. You're somebody that now didn't do something about something else you saw, and now you have to own up to that. And if you don't, then you're part of the problem. And then now you have to be scared of ever telling the truth. And that's what happens with these guys, is that the abuse happens and they just keep going. Then all of a sudden they're an accomplice. And I think that this is an important project. So I want to introduce Sarah Shiley. She is a fellow sexual assault survivor. And it's amazing how much when we meet each other, we just feel bonded and
Yeah.
so much things that we have in common for the abuse that we went through. Sarah?
Thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate that. First of all, I just want to say thank you. Amos, thank you for doing this, for all of your work, and for every survivor that has contributed. You're just all very brave, and I'm just grateful to be a part of this. I just wanted to start out, I don't want to talk too much about the actual abuse I went through, but I also think it's important for people to recognize that, it did happen and I was a child. I have a picture of me right here. This is me about 7 years old. My abuse happened at the hands of a priest from the ages of 7 until 14. I estimated that it was probably over 200 times that I was abused by him. He was a family friend. My parents were very involved in our church, and he was in our lives quite a bit. And unfortunately, he had a lot of access to me. So though my anger, of course, is towards him, my real anger is towards the diocese and the church itself for not helping me, for not saving me. And I'm going to get into that right now. Around the age of 22, 23, I actually gained the courage to speak with my older brother and my siblings, and I disclosed what had happened to me to them. With their help, we immediately made a report to the diocese. And at this time, the priest that had hurt me was still living, still practicing. He was no longer in our parish anymore. He was relocated to a country setting, but we reported him. Nothing was done. And when I say this, I was in my early 20s. And I think for me at that point, just being able to speak about it to someone, to my family, and kind of releasing that was enough. I didn't really get into too much of it. I was young. I did not go to the police. I was, I think, nervous too because he was still alive. So I was scared as well. Over the years, my siblings themselves made reports. We had family friends that made reports. I would get angry once in a while and call again and make a report. So numerous reports were made, and yet this priest still remained where he was. And it was very confusing for me. I was feeling an intense amount of guilt, just knowing that he could be hurting someone else. In 2006, he actually passed away. My sister-in-law gave me a call, and it was a relief to me, but at the same time, it stirred up everything again. And then in 2018, the diocese asked victims to come forward, and they released a list of, I want to say, about 50 priests' names. And I got done working. I'm a teacher, and I was off of work, and I wanted to pull up the list. I pulled it up, just kind of bracing myself to see this priest's name on this list. And going through the list, I read it like 5 times. His name wasn't there. And I was shaking. I was angry. I was shaking. Why was his name not there? Why was he not on the list? So I immediately called. They have a victims coordinator. I contacted her again. I said, I've reported this person. He is not on the list. Why is he not on the list? So she said she would look into it. Again, nothing came out of it. And for people that know me, I'm a pretty quiet person. I kind of keep to myself. It's not like me to be outspoken in any way, but this is different. This has to do with kids, and I just felt it was so wrong. So I actually contacted a local reporter here and, asked him if he had any information. He actually got the priest's name out. And my main reason for doing that was I knew statistically there is no way I could have been the only victim. And, you know, Steve, you had mentioned that too. Like, just, it's heartbreaking to know. So, because of that, his name was out because of, not because the diocese put it out, but because I did. And unfortunately, or I don't want to say fortunately, I always felt very alone with this, but when his name came out, other survivors ended up coming forward as well. And what I found out a few weeks ago, there are now 2 other survivors who were hurt by the same priest before me. And there lies that anger of the enabling. They knew, the diocese knew, and instead of removing this priest and calling the police and reaching out to victims, which they've never done, they never did, they just moved him, and they moved him to my parish, and that's where he started with me. So the torment, all the abuse, my young childhood cut short, this healing that I'm going to have to do for the rest of my life could have been prevented had they done the right thing. And what is still very disturbing to me is that there are people after me that he hurt as well, and it's not okay. And what I want to say here also is there's a clear lack of empathy for the victims, for the survivors, but all I see from them is that they will do everything to protect their name and the institution. It has nothing to do with taking care of the kids. They are more, they want to protect their institution. They want to protect who they are as the church. And it's just, it needs to change. And I'm grateful for Amos for doing this book, because it is, like Steve said, critical. It's so important. People need to be held accountable.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah and Steve, so much for sharing your stories. Those were incredibly impactful. And I see in the question and answer box that we have several people who have expressed great gratitude to you for your willingness to be open and to share with us today. We did get one question from Russell that I think is a good question to start with, which says, please parse the language, victim versus survivor, which is appropriate, why and when?
So I'll take
one of us, or who do you want to answer that?
Whoever wants to start. Steve, did you want to start? And then and Amos could jump in.
I'm just going to say, the weird thing about this is that, you know, when this abuse occurred back in the 90s, you know, I'm Steve. I'm a person. I've never considered myself a survivor or a victim or anything. So it's really hard for me to reconcile what language is appropriate for whom. I think that it's important to understand that I'm a fighter and I'm not a victim. So I do understand why people don't like to use the word victim. I think sometimes we get in the semantics of what is politically correct or appropriate, and we kind of forget that we're human beings, and we just want people to validate us and to listen to us. That's what we want to be.
Yeah, I would say the same. You know, I kind of interchange them. I just want my voice heard, as I think most of the survivors do. We just want to be heard and believed.
If I can jump in on that question, and Scott will know this because we went through the draft of the book, I don't know how many times. I initially referred to today's survivors, I refer to them as victims. And in one of the interactions with one of the survivors, it was she said to me, stop calling me a victim. I'm not a victim. I survived. And if and then I talked with other people I interviewed about the victim survivor question, and it became unanimous that they were survivors. They were not victims. I think that they perceived, and Sarah and Steve can speak about this better than I can, there was some negative attached from their perspective to being perceived as a victim rather than the positive of being perceived as a survivor. And so I totally chose to go that route at their request. And from my perspective, I agree. I mean, I understand it. And so I'm very, very comfortable that's the way, that's how the terminology is survivor, because overwhelmingly they view themselves as having survived. But if I may, one more word, they survived twice. They survived the attack and they survived the enabler. And on that note, there's also a reason the book is called Armies of Enablers. That was not my idea. It was really called Army of Enablers. One of the survivors said to me, Guiora, there was not an army, there were armies. And everywhere I turned, this way, this way, this way, there was this army and multiple army. Steve's in the army, right? You have multiple armies, you have armies. And that's where the title of the book comes from. It was not my idea. It was at the request of one of the survivors. And for them, surviving enablers, I think, has given them, as you can hear from Sarah and Steve, extraordinary strength, to share this webinar with us, because they feel that they have survived the armies, not only the predator, but the armies. And I think that is why, to Russ's question, I think the survivor designation in this context is much more affirming than the victim terminology.
Yeah, agreed. Kate asked another good kind of introductory question, which is, the survivors have referenced the project. Is this book launching specific action? And if so, what does it entail?
So 3 different answers, right? One is platforms like the Dean has enabled here. And as I said at the very beginning, I made the survivors 2 promises. One is to have as many opportunities as possible to have their voices heard. And as I wrote to Steve and Sarah this morning, the whole point of this is their voices be heard, because if we don't hear their voices, we will never, ever understand the consequence of the enabler. I mean, I can talk forever, but they were there, and they need to explain to the audiences the consequence of the enabler. And for me, that was the point of this undertaking. 2, much in the same way that I've been involved in bystander legislation, both here in Utah and in other jurisdictions around the United States, I am dedicated to working with legislators here in Utah and elsewhere on the possibility of criminalizing the enabler. For me, an enabler who it knew and or should have known from the positions of authority about the abuse that people like Steve and Sarah suffered and chose not to intervene, that's a crime. That's not a moral crime, that's a crime. And I understand the pushback, I get, there's been pushback on this, but I think it's absolutely essential to engage with the broader public on the possibility of criminalizing enabler, and not just, passing it off and saying, oh, that's, it's a shame. It's not a shame, it's a crime. And the third thing is absolutely to be involved, as the Dean knows, in working with institutions in terms of their understanding of accountability and responsibility. Goes back to Scott's excellent comments at the very beginning. And the third thing, maybe it all ties in together. I'm well aware of the fact that people don't really want to have this conversation. Ask Steve, ask Sarah. People don't want to have this conversation. We have no choice but to have this conversation, because there's an absolute need to educate the public. And educating the public is one of the things that we as educators do. We have this wonderful platform. I think we absolutely have an obligation in whatever manner or form to be as involved as possible educating the public. And, as I said earlier, the survivors humbled me. I know no other word. And in return to their trusting me with their horrible stories, the least I can do is to fight the good fight and to have people join me in that battle. This is not going to be, it's not overnight. It's not one and done. This is it's being in for the long slog. And I'm to the question, I'm all in. I see, frankly, in terms of my professional career, there's nothing more important than this.
Agreed. We have a question from Angela that I think both from a survivor perspective and from an ally perspective. Angela asked, when a survivor tells their story, is filing a police report enough? What else can we do? And I think that we could maybe be from a survivor's perspective and then also from an ally's perspective, somebody who wants to support the survivor.
I'll just speak to my case. When I went to Dr. Grayson and talked to him, you know, at the time, I didn't know what, I was a kid. I didn't know what I should do. They were the adults. They had the positions of power. They were the doctors. I was a student. And there's a power dynamic there that you really entrust them to give you what you should do. And so in 2019, Dr. Grace did an interview for a newspaper, and they said, why didn't you call the police? And his answer were, they were adults, they could have done it. And that is absolutely infuriating to me, because again, we just want to be empowered. We want to be empowered with information. Let me know that a kid got assaulted right before me. Let me know what I can do. Let me know my options, and I'll take it from there. But don't enable him by not telling me what my options are, or, you know, hiding that stuff from me, or implying that I was an adult and somehow I should have known better. That's just so insulting.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak a little bit on that as well. You know, back when I first disclosed in my early 20s, I was scared. And I was also brought up heavily Catholic, and you trust that, first of all, that the church is going to take care of you and protect you. But then when I did go to disclose, that they would take care of the problem. And, you know, someone had actually mentioned, I saw one of the questions about my parents. One thing that I think unfortunately happens a lot is that these predators will look for kind of like the weak link, a family that might be going through a lot. My mother was very ill at a young age with cancer, and then my father ended up passing away very young. They actually both passed away in their early 40s. So it was a family of 5 children, and we were trying our best. So my older brother was, you know, like a father figure to me. And, you know, so with regards to involving the police, I mean, now the DA has all the information, but back then we were young, we were children, and we didn't know better, so.
Yeah. There was a good point going back to that language of survivor versus victim. Somebody put into the comments that RAIN, which I believe is the national organization, offers some helpful information about how they use victim or survivor. Victim is typically used directly following the assault, while a survivor is someone who's gone through the recovery process. However, it ultimately should be left to the preference of the individual. So thank you very much for sharing that. That's helpful. And then there was a follow-up to this question of allyship, Steve, where somebody asked, let me see, Jill asked, Steve, you mentioned we went. Who was with you, and who were your allies that helped him? I think along with this theme of allies and how we can help.
Sure. So when I went in to talk to them, one thing that I didn't really discuss too much is that when I was assaulted by this male physician, I was gay at the time, and I was coming out. I took the person that I was dating, who was a male, to the thing with me, just as a I don't know, as a, whatever you call it, like a trying to think of the word, like a ally, or I don't know why I'm just blanking on.
Ally is a good word.
Yeah, whatever. Anyway, so I took him in there. One thing that I didn't talk about, some of the trauma for this, is that going through this and realizing what Strauss did to all these people, you know, I've worked with all these wrestlers who have also been assaulted, and we were in a room together, and I finally told them, I said, I want you guys to know that this has been horrific for me in so many ways, because I never told my parents about the abuse when it happened in the 90s. because I was scared of what they would think of gay people. I mean, imagine the levels of trauma that that puts on you to think, I don't want people to think that gay people do this to people. And I was bearing the guilt for what this creepy predator did myself, and not wanting to tell my parents. So I took him as a witness. That's the word I was working for. So I took him as a witness, but you know, I mean, all these years later, I finally got to confront these other survivors and say, I want you guys to know how horrific I think what he did to all of us was. And that's coming from a gay person. And had these wrestlers come up and hug me. And I thought, you know, I mean, after all that they went through with this guy and how much they must just despise any gay people for what they went through, you know, we bonded. Like these survivors bonded over this. And it was just an incredible moment. So, but yeah, I took my male relationship, my partner there.
Great. Alan asks if you can please comment on the current federal and state standards of enabler legal liability. So I think this one goes to Professor Guiora.
It's a great question. One of the things that I very much hope to be involved in moving forward is addressing this both on a federal level and a state by state level, much as has been the case in the bystander question. There's been suggestions that we need to view an enabler as an accomplice, as a co-conspirator, and I reject that. These are two very different functions. There's the predator or the predators who assaulted Sarah, whether they assaulted Sarah, whether they assaulted Steve or the other survivors in the book. And then there are the enablers. And those are two very different categories. And to view them as a co-conspirator or as an accomplice, I reject that. There have been a couple of enablers who have been prosecuted and convicted, but not under enabling law, but under other laws, which in essence related to enablers. And I think that misses the point. I think what we really need to do in context of your question is to address this directly in terms of legislating enabling legislation, or legislation that criminalizes the enabler, whether at a federal level or a state by state level. And I think failure to do that, as I mentioned earlier, does nothing more than ensure that the next victim survivor is around the corner. And so I'm well aware, as I mentioned earlier, of the pushback that's inevitable to this, because there are those lawyers, particularly who are concerned about quote unquote crimes of omission rather than crimes of commission. But in the context of the enabler who, whether it's Dr. Grace in Steve's case or the priest in Sarah's parish, who knew and just pushed the priest along to the other parish, right, sir? That's exactly what they do. That's somewhere between omission and commission, and that absolutely has to be perceived as a crime, in the same way that in the USA gymnastics, the officials who knew that the girls then, the women today, but girls then, were going to go see Larry Nassar, the doctor, alone in the room, unsupervised, unattended, and they were sending them to him. First of all, nobody sends a 13-year-old child alone to a doctor when you're at a meet. And that's what was happening time after time and time again, much like in Steve's case at Ohio State. And those people who were facilitating that, enabling that, to simply pass that off as, oh, well, they really didn't know, I just refuse to accept that. And in the context, in response to the question, I am all in on whether it's federal level, state level, to directly addressing the question of enabling. I get the pushback, but I will push back to the pushback because that's my promise to the survivors.
Along those lines, Stephanie and Jay both ask kind of similar questions, which is how far up the food chain should this go? Should liability extend to friends and families who do nothing, to individuals who may be standing around and might be aware that individuals would be encountering the abuser? And maybe Steve and Sarah, based on your experiences, you might have some thoughts on this as well. But how far out should we define enabler, and how far out should, or up the food chain or down the food chain, should liability extend?
So my answer is pretty brutal. I think that that President Drake from the Ohio State University either was negligent in knowing what's going on under the investigation and everything that's happening now with the current Ohio State University, or is complicit because they know what they're doing now. I mean, I'm not going to get into some of this stuff, the cover-up stuff that's happening now, but I feel like that when you're the top person, you can't say. One of the things that's the most frustrating for us is that when somebody says, look, it's not me, It wasn't me. It wasn't, it wasn't anybody that works here anymore. You can't tell that to us. You're the organization. If you don't take responsibility for it, if nobody takes responsibility for it, then nobody takes responsibility for it ever. So institutions all the time can do that by saying, well, we have thousands of employees. I didn't know what that person did. Or in Ohio State University's case, they told me Richard is dead, Louise works in Worthington, and Ted now works in Illinois. And that's what they told me. And I said, no, that's not fair. And so I'm going after Dr. Grace's license with the Ohio State Medical Board. And right now they've cited his license, and he has a hearing scheduled in January. And that's my message of empowerment to survivors, is that you don't have to accept those answers. You can say everybody from the top down should be liable. And that's my opinion. And I could just be answering angrily, but that's my opinion. Either you know and you're complicit in it, or you're negligent because you don't know. So you need to be responsible. Somebody has to be responsible.
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same. I just reached out to someone last week and asked how I could get a hold of the Pope. They laughed and I said, no, I'm serious. They need to be held accountable for this. They dropped the ball, and I obviously through media we've learned that it's happening all over the world. It's not just the United States. Something is systematically wrong, and they need to be held accountable for it. So
yeah. Well, I see that our time is 8:57, so I'm going to ask the last question, which is a combination of several questions that have been asked, which is really, how does this move forward? So one person, for example, said, I'm a victim survivor. How do I get involved in research on this and related topics? If giving voice to my experiences can make a difference, I'd like to. And then also somebody was asking, what's the future of this research? Is it going to be international? By the way, Sarah, somebody says you should contact the Pope. You can send him an email or snail mail. So there you go. But what's the future of the research? Do you see this going international? So basically, how could victim survivors get involved? And then where does this project go from here?
I would say from a survivor perspective, one of the things that was an unanticipated consequence with this is when I became vocal with my story. And I always say, I'm not ashamed of what happened to me. I shouldn't be ashamed. It should be all the people that facilitated the abuse. It should be the guy that abused me. They're the ones that should be ashamed, not me. And so by doing that, I started having friends reach out to me saying, Steve, I just want you to know that I was abused by my father for years, and I never told anybody about that. And I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready to be an advocate or to be a spokesperson for survivors. But I realized that by empowering myself with using the power of my voice, and I always say, trust the power of your voice, that it shows strength. And I think that enables you to be able to advocate for yourself and for other people. And when people see that strength, they draw on that, and it makes them strong enough to say something. And so I think that we need to facilitate those voices. We need to listen, validate people, don't doubt somebody. Don't say, why now? What is your motivation? Listen to them, understand, try to advocate for them, and advocate for them to use their voice. And I think that if we do that, we're going to come a long ways.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, just briefly from my own experience. I was a domestic violence advocate, and something along the lines of 95 to 97% of survivors and victims who come forward are telling the truth. So the likelihood that somebody is not telling the truth is actually just statistically quite low. And Professor Guerra, final thoughts on where this is going and kind of next steps?
I can only add to what Steve said. As I found over the course of working on the book, when people hear about the project, people read about the project. As you know, Dean, I get emails from all kinds of people who previously had not reached out to me. Not to make this sound dramatic, I'm here. I'm easy to find, I'm online, I have an email, I have a cell number. This for me is my project. And the fact that I have, Steve and Sarah and the others locked in and on the team, it is a team effort. They're saying no, it's one person show, it's a team. I think that that's the only way we can address the question of the enabler or the enablers is by teaming together. And for me, I have made a commitment to those people who spent 15 months with me sharing their stories. This for me is the single most important thing I can do. And anybody who wants to reach out to me, I'm easy to find on the web. My email's out there, my cell number's out there. Call me, and I will work with you in getting your story out. And absolutely not only your story, which is critical, but also in terms of working with legislators, working with the media, and with a broader public, because otherwise we'll just, Dean, we'll sit here a year from now, we'll just go through this all over again. We will not have made the kind of impact that absolutely must be made.
Agreed. And the institution's very interested in this work as well. So people feel free to contact me. Professor Guerra's email address is just Amos.Guerra. So at law.utah.edu. So you have his name up there on your screen. So I encourage you to reach out. And with that, again, I just want to thank all of our speakers today. It was a wonderful conversation. I wish we had more time. My apologies to all of the attendees. I know that there were several questions that we didn't get to, but I think that just speaks to the power of this discussion, the importance of this discussion, and we will continue having these discussions. So this is the first, but certainly not the last. And thank you everybody for joining us, and we hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.